me. If you can't, please drop a line in the chat window and somebody will come and help me. So today's presentation, as Nick said, is researching your military ancestor on Ancestry and Beyond. And my name is Leslie Anderson, and I've been the Ancestry spokesperson for the last 13 years out here in Ottawa. And you do have my contact information and Glenn's on the slide here if you want to take a note of it, as well as the last slide that Glenn has also will have our emails. But I understand that Beechwood will be posting up the handout that we were physically going to provide as well as electronically. So that will be on the YouTube section of the site. So we did have this agenda, and it's going to follow it loosely now, but certainly we're not going to hold, unfortunately, the military tour of Beechwood, but we will have time for questions after the presentations. So I thought I'd start with Ancestry and Online Trees, because when we're researching our military ancestors, we need a place to put the information that we find and the stories that we create and the connections that we have. And so Ancestry hosts the world's largest online family history collection, and really the key metrics are that we have over 30 plus international markets, 80 countries of origin, 18 million plus profiles in our DNA test that have DNA tested, as well as the key one is 330 million photographs, scanned documents, and written stories have been attached to these trees, so that you can maybe get some hints and some information from other people who are researching your ancestors. So we are a family of websites on Ancestry, and it started out with Ancestry.com in 1996, and from there it morphed into localized websites for each of these countries. So if you started out with .com and you would get the world, it is now a membership-based where you can purchase a subscription in Canadian dollars for Ancestry.ca World Deluxe. And we do have all of these other countries represented by individual websites, country websites. And to get to them, you go to the bottom right-hand corner of Ancestry, and you can simply click on the different website pages, and in that country's language, you will be able to search and investigate their records. So as I mentioned, Ancestry DNA is also available, which can connect you with living cousins, living members of your family and your ancestors' descendants. So I know a lot of you are interested in your ethnicity estimates, showing you where in the world you came from, but really the power behind it is the connections that you make through DNA to living family members. If you wanted to purchase a subscription, we do offer you a 14-day trial to explore it, and you do have different memberships here. You could go month by month or purchase 6 months all at once for just Canadian records, or if you want everything on Ancestry, there are these memberships as well. It works out to about $30 a month. Or you save some money if you purchase it over 6 months. And that gives you the whole world's records, the whole access to trees, and all of the historical records that we have on Ancestry. If you haven't started your tree, I suggest you do, and it's very easy to get started. Obviously, you locate family documents and get all the information organized that you can, and scan it into your family tree on Ancestry, interview those family members, create a family tree online that's free on Ancestry, educate yourself, get good research guides and maps of the area, and understand the land and the times that your ancestors came from. Record everything, search and confirm historical records, and many of those historical records are available with your membership or your 2-week free trial on Ancestry. Research in libraries, archives, and museums, and genealogy societies, because not everything is available online at this time. And the whole point of Ancestry and doing your genealogy really is to network and collaborate with other people who are either researching the same ancestors or perhaps in the same place that your ancestors came from, so you can learn more about it. So these are the top tips I have for your family tree. Start with yourself and work backwards. And remember, all living information that you put on the Ancestry family tree is hidden. It's algorithmed out for other people to find you. It's not searchable. Use one tree for both sides. So if you start with yourself, you're going to have your paternal or your father's side, or maternal and your mother's side, and go back as far as you can using full names, dates of birth, marriage, death, any information that you had collected or can find out. Approximate is fine, but please include place names. Don't just say England. If that's all you know, that's all you can say, but hopefully you can find out, drill down a little bit as to the land that they lived in and the actual county or even the village that they lived in. I suggest on Ancestry that you put all of your direct line ancestors' full names in capitals. So not just the last name, but the full name in capitals. And this has helped me over the years. And I have been researching for, oh my gosh, 50 years, believe it or not. And my ancestors have tons of kids that all are renamed the same name, and they have, based on my descendancy, I have, to be honest, I forget who's my guy or who's my girl that I descended from. So I can recognize them in a list of names quite easily when they're all capitalized. Always use maiden names or birth names for females. Ancestry's going to figure it out. They're going to figure out what happened to her when she got married, or if she married 3 times. She's still going to be categorized under her maiden name, and all of the documents can be added to her under that name. Scan any pictures and documents that you find and upload it to the gallery. And the gallery on Ancestry I'm going to show you in a little bit, but it really holds all of the historical documentation, like censuses and other historical records, as well as your own scanned images and stories and things like that. Know the difference between public and private trees. Ancestry anonymizes that living information, and also I understand that people are nervous about putting up your husband and your children's information or any other living information, but Ancestry's algorithm obliterates that. And in fact, if you were looking for me and my tree and see my kids and my husband, you won't even be able to search for me on Ancestry. So any information, living information, is not findable on Ancestry. So once you've done your tree, there are 2 views that you can view your tree. These buttons up here that I've outlined in red this is your pedigree view. So this is my great-grandmother and her family that I've zoned in on, and this is her father and the mother side of the family. Or you could go by the family view on the second icon. So this view shows the brothers and sisters and so on. Okay, I was just told there was a little delay, slide to slide, so it should be catching up, because I tend to talk more than 10 seconds. So this is the family view, and the family view is, I don't use it, to be honest, because it's very cumbersome, because they have lots of kids in the family, but you just basically click and drag it around until you find the person that you want, and then you can click on them to bring up their profile. So their profile is the page that you've created based on the information that you've got, and you have their birth, their death information up here, and also you'll notice underneath that information the relationship to you. So you know your trees can get wild and crazy and lots of people. Always that person, if you have checked it off under the tree settings, will show that relationship to you or your husband or whoever you are related to. So this section here shows the tree name, and that you can search, and there's some tools here that I have shown underneath. I like to have those tools out so I can see them, I can remember them, but they are all available there. What you can also see from the tree name, and I've highlighted it in red, is view tree, so you can view this person in the tree. You can, oh, I can't read that, I'm too blurry, but these are all the different options related to that person. You can share, you can see that person's gallery of pictures and documents as well. What I like is the second tab, or the first tab is the life story tab, and based on that information that you attach to your tree through Ancestry, Ancestry will create a story, and you can edit that story. So this is what we think is interesting, but it can show a map, it shows a summary, and as you go down the tree, you can see different facts and relationships for that person in this nice, easy life story. So if you do share your tree, I find people, when I used to share my tree, people would just go, okay, there's a bunch of names and dates. This puts context to the person and the dates and documents that you've attached, and even puts the context around the historical events that you have for that time period that your person was living. So under the facts tab, so this is the most important tab to me as I'm researching, this gives you all of the information, again, based on the documents you've attached, and if you have attached them from Ancestry, you will see the middle part, which is the sources, as well as the right-hand side, which is the family. So you can add and change relationships under the family, you can add and change the timeline, but everything is great because it's in one place. The next tab is gallery, and just quickly, this again is where all of your information goes, whether or not it is a document, a story, or a photo, or you want to create a story yourself. So you can do that right here for each person in your profile. And sometimes I just upload my notes to this section of the gallery, and I say I want to create a story, or I upload a story, and it's just basically my Word document that I have created. When you have a bunch of items in your gallery, you can sort it by A to Z or a media type and that kind of thing. But what I love is that I took this picture. This is my ancestral home, and I had this picture in my gallery, and I attached it to certain people on the tree, so when I go to their profiles, they'll be able to see that picture. But I can see by all of these little heads that they took my picture and put it in their tree. So I can follow through by clicking on those heads to say, hey, I see that you've got my Wind Whistle Farm in your tree, and you can even click on their heads and go to their tree if it's public, and go see that person that they attached it to. So our hinting system looks first at our most popular databases. So the big databases like census, birth, marriage, and death, draft cards, passenger list, to see if there's enough information in your tree and the record to give us a high degree of confidence that it's going to be for the same person. And we look at other member trees to see whether they were looking and using those same documents. So you can see whether you've got a hint by these little leaves, and they work for both trees and historical information. So I got one for my great-great-grandfather, and it came to pass that it was a burial register, and this immediately came from one of the collections that we had on Ancestry that I hadn't had a chance to explore. And I didn't even know it was there until I got a hint. So I look at the hint, and you always review your hints, because it is that, and it'll give you the typing, and then you can view the actual document. And I found out that my Robert Platts was actually, he was from Grassmore, but I could never find his burial or his tombstone. Maybe he didn't even have a tombstone, but I couldn't find his burial register because he was buried in Temple, Normanton in Derbyshire. So it is fantastic to use these hints to analyze them and attach them to your tree if it fits. And they keep on coming. So the minute you do a quick tree, maybe you want to research some unknown people that you've connected with in DNA, for example, and you want to create a quick tree, these hints will pop up instantaneously. It's just amazing that you have such an amazing research assistant. And if you are finding records, I'm just going to call your attention to the right-hand side of some of the searches that you do when you go and look at the record. Sorry, we call it the record, but it's not the actual record. But you look at the typing part, the indexed part, and we will suggest other records that other people in other trees have actually attached to that, a person named Joseph Bick in this case. So talking about adding records, when you do go to a document or information like an index on Ancestry, you have the opportunity through the hint to assess it, say yes or no or maybe that it is that person, and they keep it attached. If it's attached, great, it'll be attached to that person. But if it's maybe, they'll keep it in the hints bin for you to go back later and take a look. Or if it says, if you say no, it will still keep that document suggestion in another bin called you declined, so you didn't use. But when you come to a document that you've searched yourself on Ancestry, you have the opportunity to save it to a person in your tree, save it to a computer, or save it to your shoebox. And a shoebox is just a place that keeps the link to all of your saved documents that you haven't used, and that is on the home page. There are different ways to search on Ancestry if you're going to do it yourself. The first is the global search. Search all of the Ancestry databases at once, and this is all of the records, all of the family trees, everything we have on Ancestry. You can do that just by going to the search tab, except for Nova Scotia. And I just call that out because a lot of people don't realize that Nova Scotia, under their legal restrictions, only allowed their records to be searched with an agreement. So you have to go and find those records either on a map, which we do allow you to look for different areas around the world, and you can find out and search by the different collections through a map. Or you can go to a category search, which would be giving you the ability to search all the databases within similar records, a group of similar records. So all of the census records from around the world, all of the birth, marriage, and death, all of the military records. And then you can even hone down to an individual database where you can search for an ancestor there, and you can find these individual databases all over the place, all over Ancestry. Any marketing that we do, you might hear of those individual databases, but really the card catalog is the best place to go. And then of course you can search for your family tree. So, or from your family tree. So the home tab of Ancestry is where you can also search, but I'm going to ask you to hold off from searching from the home tab because there's a lot of other great things going on the home tab. including looking for these new individual collections that we're posting on Ancestry. So you can look for all of the Canadian records and when they were posted, as well as other countries' records. So you can see what has been posted in the last few months or so. That card catalog is found under the search tab, and the search tab is past all of these categories. You go down to card catalog, and this is where you can search by title or keyword. So if you're looking for a keyword of loyalists or a title of a collection with the word loyalist or marriage or something in it, you can check off that you want to show Canadian collections only. If you've got a World Deluxe membership or a free trial for all the world's records, you can uncheck that and see all of the records from around the world. You can also filter by the collection and dates, and I find this is really, really handy to have those dates available. Most of the searching I do is from the search tab, and you can see all of the different categories you can search under. And if you just clicked on the search tab on the right-hand side of my slide, I've shown you where you can find that map. So that location map is beyond the fields that you type in on Ancestry. And then we've highlighted a lot of other documents, a lot of other collections that we couldn't fit under the categories, obviously, but there's even photos and probates and wills and things like that, and pictures and other interesting collections. So every now and then just scroll past those fields, even though I know everyone's excited to get searching. But today we're here to talk about military collections, and in order to search military collections, you go to that search tab. It is a global search. You're going to pick military, and it's going to search all of the records if you just filled in the fields. However, on the right-hand side, we call out different collections related to the Canadian or whatever country's page you're on. And the featured data collections, if you can see there in the red box, I've highlighted the Canadian military collections, where we've grouped all of the Canadian only, and it could tie into the British being, Canadian as well. And you will see just, just columns of information of the different collections that we do have from the time the military was in Canada and related collections. So we do have a number of these. I plan on highlighting them, as I know Glenn will be talking about World War I and World War II. And so let's get started. So we have the British military in Canada, and I always like to start with a little bit of history. And so I have a map here that in 1750, North America really looked like this. And you can see this, well, on my screen here it looks pink, but it could be orange. It shows what New France, which is an extensive French empire in North America, where it was. And in green, you can see Spain, New Spain, and blue is the 13 colonies. So you can see all of what Britain was responsible for at this time in 1750. There are some significant events in the 18th century that we're going to be covering. So we have 1755 is really the start in the 18th century. And this Louisbourg is, I never knew really where it was, but it's on Cape Breton, Ile Royale to the French, who lost the fortress twice, once in 1745, recovered by treaty, and permanently in 1758. Then we have the French and Indian Wars. After a year after losing Louisbourg, Quebec fell to the British. And actually, I found it was coincidental that earlier this week, September 13th, in 1759, the British and French forces engaged outside the walls of Quebec City in the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham, marking a turning point in the history of New France. And the French capitulated in 1763, and by the Treaty of Paris, virtually all French possessions in North America were ceded to the British. And then we have the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution. British troops were, of course, already stationed in North America in the 13 colonies that were shown. But as we know, the colonists were not happy, or at least most of them weren't happy, and the first shots of the rebellion were fired in 1775, and it would forever change the face of North America. The British North American colonies to the north were not part of the rebellion, and in fact, we benefited from the thousands of loyalists who streamed north, took up land, and settled in what remained the British presence in North America. And in the 1800s, they saw lots of reasons to engage the British military. So we start with the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. This really confirmed the separate existence of the United States and the future of Canada. We've got the rebellions of 1837 and 38. This was an abortive uprising in Upper and Lower Canada, and it was quickly suppressed by local militia and British regulars. We've got the Civil War, and the United States had a civil war, but several thousand Canadians served as soldiers during the United States Civil War, most of them on the Northern Union side. For example, about 20,000 Canadians and former Canadians served in the Michigan regiments. Then we have the Fenian raids, the Fenian invasions. 2 different times, a few hundred Irish nationalists invaded Canada from the United States, but they were repulsed again by local militia. In 1871, with the exception of 2 battalions in Halifax, all the British Army units were withdrawn from Canada and defense was turned over to that militia. The Northwest Campaign, Canadian militia from many provinces participated in defeating Louis Riel's rebellion in the West. And we have finally the Boer War, which is the South African War. About 7,400 troops from Canada served in the South African War, and 242 of them died. Glenn, as I said, will be talking about the 20th century records. And I'd like to start about the British military in Canada. And as I said, from the 1750s until the early 1870s, British forces defended Canada, and records relating to the British Army and the Royal Navy in Canada are an important source of information about our ancestors. British military records document the service of officers and enlisted men who served in Canada, or even those regiments who didn't serve in Canada, but the ones who did serve in Canada were under different regimental companies. So they came along for the ride in the records. I'll explain a little bit later. But they consist of service and discharge documents and related material. In most cases, we're going to find the age, birthplace, personal details, occupations, and even physical descriptions. A large number of the men who served in the British Army were born in Ireland, Germany, Holland, and other European countries. Canadians contributed too by joining the voluntary militia to be prepared for any eventuality. Some of these records identify men born in the late 17th century, so the late 1600s, and even in the early decades of the 18th century. So researchers are going to wish they had an ancestor in the British Army, given the fact of all of the personal information available. These regimental registers of service, they contain the records of the soldiers and officers who served in the British Army regiments under the Crown. So these records document things such as enlistment, commissions and appointments, dates of service, service history, casualties, pay and pensions, desertion if they deserted, and discharges. These records are so rich in detail, and they can provide key genealogical information, including name, age, birth dates, and birthplaces, as well as those physical descriptions, histories, and commissions, their trades, and more that are just going to, make your ancestors come to life. This one in particular shows an officer's marriage details and the various places that he was stationed to throughout the births of his children at the bottom of the document. You even get his children's names, I believe. Here I found an attestation paper for Robert McLaughlin, and this is the image of one of the sides of the page. This is when he signed up in Quebec, enlisted in Belfast as an 18-year-old. What's so great is it shows the actual place where he was born, Callander, Perth County, Scotland, and his occupation was a baker, and he had no previous military service prior to enlisting. And his description, you can't read it there, but he's 5'8 and a half, so quite a large man. Light gray eyes, light brown hair, and a fresh complexion. And he was pretty healthy when he started, in the British military. I want to talk about a local example here around Ottawa. The 100th Regiment, the County of Dublin Regiment it was known as. It was raised in 1804 and was shipped to Canada in the autumn of 1805. While some of the soldiers were of English or Scottish extraction, over half were recruited in Ulster, so they were Irish. In the war with the United States in 1812, after a few skirmishes around Upper New York, the regiment went down to the Niagara area. For the 100th, it seems from the research completed by their descendants, most of them were from County Fermanagh, where a depot was maintained in the county seat of Enniskillen. In 1816, there were an amalgamation of units causing a renumbering to take place of the regiments, and the 100th became the 99th, and the 101st became the 100th. All of the renumbered regiments were disbanded in 1818, and all of them served in North America. And the British at that time were really worried about the prospect of a large number of these trained, unemployed ex-soldiers returning back home to Ireland or England, and they basically left the soldiers stranded and the officers on half pay, and it caused incredible unemployment levels. So what they did was they offered military land grants on military settlements such as Perth, Lanark, and Richmond in Upper Canada. The Richmond settlement was comprised of men and their families who had served in several regiments, but primarily those of the 99th, the ex-100s, and took up the offer. And Beechwood Cemetery has a very interesting, intriguing woman reburied here, called Mariah Hill, and she is what historians call the daughter of the regiment, and she married Sergeant Andrew Hill, an Irish soldier in the 100th, in 1811, and she was one of the wives who went along with the regiments, with the army, and they permitted her to travel to the forts and armed camps where they were given food rations and accommodations in return for caring for 600 men in the regiment. And Beechwood has a wonderful document here sort of highlighting the people in the cemeteries, where you can find a lot more about Mariah Hill and the people buried here as well. So speaking of settling in these regiments, well, the records of the children that are born to these soldiers were actually registered at a garrison chapel. Normally, it's the closest Anglican parish to the place that the company was stationed, so that the Anglican churches in Amherstburg, Niagara, Kingston, Montreal, Quebec, St. John's, etc., are where these records would be located and have been preserved in their archives. Many of these records have been digitized. The local Catholic, Presbyterian, or Baptist clergy, they baptized those of their own religion. Some of the Richmond pioneers' marriages took place at the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Quebec City. And you can see here on Ancestry for Quebec, we have the Quebec Vital and Church records, no matter what denomination they are, from the Drouin collection. And you can see I can browse this list and go to specifically Montreal or another group, find the garrison or the Anglican parish register I'm looking in, and then I can get to the actual event that happened from that garrison. We now have the records of the British military headquarters, and this contains images of letters, returns, and memorials from field officers and military departments in Canada, as well as general orders issued in the Canada and Nova Scotia commands. And these documents also can contain names and dates and locations and other details that relate to the key military events like the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the early decades of the 19th century. Now, these records can be browsed by region and title only, meaning that it has not been indexed. And these are where you're going to find the loyalists. And so some hints around here. Well, first of all, what is a loyalist? And a loyalist is when American independence was officially recognized in 1783. Americans who had remained loyal to the British Crown were persecuted, and they were forced out of their homes. The British government came to the aid of these loyalists and arranged for transportation for those who wished to leave. Many chose to settle in Nova Scotia, which then included New Brunswick, and Quebec, which then included Ontario. And just a little bit of history here. In 1791, the colony of Quebec was divided to create Upper Canada, which was present-day Ontario, and Lower Canada, present-day Quebec. So depending on the dates that you're looking for your ancestors, it may be not called Ontario. It might be called Upper Canada, and vice versa for Lower Canada and Quebec. England offered a tempting refuge for loyalists, and any man or woman who could prove their support of the Crown during the war. Obviously, they moved to Canada, but they also received a grant of 200 acres of land or more. Military and civilian settlers submitted petitions to the governor to obtain Crown land, and even sons and daughters of the loyalists were also entitled to a certain amount of free land. So when you're researching your ancestor and maybe get a hint that they were a loyalist or any research at all, you really need to arm yourself with some knowledge. So you need to get a good book or a research guide. And in this case, looking for loyalists, Brenda Merriman's book is wonderful. You're going to get a guide to necessary sources and background information. And of course, the United Empire Loyalists, their website of Canada, they've got wonderful resources, including directories that will lead you to living family members. And Ancestry has created a Loyalist research guide and links on our blog. But if you go to the Facebook page, Ancestry.ca Facebook page here, there are videos covering many topics, including mine, called Uncovering Your Loyalist Roots. So if you're a visual person or you want to sit down with a coffee and look at all of the videos that we have on our Ancestry site, that is really worth your time. So Ancestry has pulled about 25 collections related to the Loyalists and put them on a special page. And the URL is here, and it's going to be in your handout. But the page is not really apparent on our site. So you do need to take note of it, or if we do any, I know I mentioned it in the video, and if you notice any sort of promotions around of Loyalist records, you might want to take this collection down. But inside them, they are mostly military databases and published materials. So how do you find these records? These are browse only within that British military headquarters. You can browse by region and title, but if you go to the drop-down and choose America, Letters, Returns, etc., you'll get another drop-down pointing to all of this. And I'll just blow it up for you a bit here, that these are the different regiments that are involved as British Regular Army Loyalist specific units. And so you can go to those, but I've highlighted the miscellaneous returns, which is volume 10. And so volume 10 is where all of those Loyalist lists are and things like that you might find referenced in some of the publications, and you want to go to the original document to see it. So just a hint, I thought I'd give you a copy of one of those records, and at the bottom you'll see a film strip sort of tab here, and if you go to the film strip picture, it will drop down this lower section of all of the documents, and basically you can just flip through all of the documentation like the letters and get to the lists, and you'll be able to recognize the lists there. And so this is a monthly return of the Loyalists under miscellaneous returns, volume 10. This is a list of the Loyalists from the province of New York in 1777, sworn before a government official, of all of the Loyalists that were there. And this one is dated in St. John's in September 1782, with the names and dates of arrivals and where they came from. Some have no option, and they've got choice of corpse there, by whom brought, years of age, and any remarks like, he has a father in the king's works at Sorel, engaged as a blacksmith, has a son in the service, lame of hand. And here's a sad one. His family were taken by the Indians in March last. Many of the Loyalist publications that have been written are digitized and online at Ancestry, and this particular one consists of the official rolls of Loyalists during the American Revolution who were recruited from North and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Following that Revolutionary War, British commissioners were appointed to examine claims of losses sustained by Loyalists in America during and following the war. Records in this database relate to Loyalist claims and cases heard by that claims commission. And so lots of great information can be found here. Again, names, residences, places and years, accounts of battles, estimates of losses, and they had to make their case, so there's evidence perhaps to some other documentation that they had to prove that their claim was real. And so you really get a good idea of how life was like and affecting your ancestors in the Loyalist War. In the 19th century, Canadians were attracted to the militia not only for learning the basics of the military practice, but also for social reasons. It was the thing to do back then. And these records consist of the nominal rolls and pay lists of the volunteer militia and document this very important and popular Canadian institution. And they're also complementing the published militia list, which is a comprehensive description of Canada's militia, its organization and officers from the 1860s to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. In addition, records for a number of Upper and Lower Canada militia units are included specifically for the years during and immediately following the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. and there's lots of extra details that you can investigate as well. I included this database because it contains various documents relating to the applications for pensions or benefits for the widows and children of British military officers who died while in the service or on the half pay. And documents include these kinds of records. And you can see that, they had to provide certificates here as well. Now remember, multiple images may be associated with an officer, so make sure you use the arrow keys to browse forward and backwards to locate any additional images. And it's always a good idea in practice to always go forward and backwards from the document that you're looking for, because there might be a second page or more information. The Chelsea pensioners. The Royal Hospital Chelsea was the administrative office for the British Army and was responsible for distributing pension payments to British soldiers since the 1680s. While some pensioners surrendered their pension to the hospital and lived there, actually called inn pensioners, many more lived outside the confines and received their pensions elsewhere. And this database contains records for soldiers who served in Canada and were applying for their pension after their service in the British military. So lots of great information. This particular, you can see from the browse, there's a couple of options. The regimental registers and soldiers' service documents are very interesting records, and they show details for the reason why they left the Army. And this is an early one, but you can see, hopefully you can see that they say worn out, lame legs, probably from having to march as far as Nova Scotia to Niagara. And it also lists where they were born and their trade. Here's Robert McLaughlin again. Oh, we're gonna go, yes, Robert McLaughlin. And this is his record of service. And the first page shows he was discharged from the 79th Foot in Quebec in 1849 after 20 years and 302 days of service. He served abroad for 13 years and 2 months, which consisted of Gibraltar for 7 years and 4 months, and in Canada for 5 years and 10 months. His cause for leaving or being discharged was unfit for service. On this second page, if you turn the application, or if you go to the second page, it shows his promotions and dates of service. And this Robert, he went from being a private for 8 years to a corporal for 2 years, then a sergeant for 5 years. But something must have happened, because it says here he was in confinement for about 2 weeks or so, and then he was reduced to a private for 2 years. Then his last year he was promoted to corporal for a year. So I wonder what happened. Records in this database come from a time when the Royal Navy established its dominance of the seas during the wars surrounding the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the War of 1812 in America. Most of the records are registers of prisoners taken between 1812 and 1815 and held in Canada. And you will find French, American, and British citizens among the prisoners. Then we have our pay lists and muster rolls for both ships and naval yards in Canada and elsewhere, even the Cape of Good Hope. Documents include records relating to the War of 1812 and the ships on the Great Lakes. So in the 1860s, the British government decided that as a colonial government, were now responsible for governing their own territory, they should also be responsible for their own defense. So by 1871, all the British garrisons had been removed, either returning to Britain or sent to duty in other imperial outposts. And finally, During the South African War or Boer War of 1899 to 1902, for the first time, Canada sent troops to fight in a war overseas. About 7,300 Canadian troops and about 12 nurses served in South Africa. In October 1899, the tensions between the Dutch South Africans, known as Boers, and the British South Africans erupted in open warfare. And the Government of Canada eventually responded to the crisis by recruiting, equipping, and transporting 2 contingents of volunteers to serve with the British forces in South Africa. The British War Office paid for everything, including pay and return transport. It was a small beginning, but by war's end, 12 women had served in the British Medical Corps as nursing sisters, really the first time Canadian women served overseas. And it happened at a time when nursing was emerging as a profession throughout the English-speaking world, so the work of the Canadian nursing sisters in South Africa ensured acceptance by military authorities. Now, going over to Library and Archives Canada, they have a site that brings together 3 groups of records pertaining to the South African War: the service files, the medal registers, and the land grant applications. And they hold almost 6,000 service files for those individuals. Unfortunately, the remaining 1,300 files no longer exist, and I think the nursing sisters are among them. I don't think their service files are included, so they got lost. These files have been digitized and are available online in the research tool. So look for the little PDF icon on Library and Archives Canada when you find your person of interest, and then download the service file from there. Veterans of the war became eligible for 320 acres of Dominion land, or a payment of $160 in scrip under the 1908 Volunteer Bounty Act. And this database contains applications for those bounty land grants. And I found a nursing sister, Mary Ellen Affleck. She has applied for land. However, most veterans opted to receive scrip in the amount of $160 rather than the land grant, or sold their land grant entitlement to a substitute. They're 2 pages long, so be sure to page forward to see the entire record. So that is the end of my portion of the presentation, discussing the earliest records that we can find for the British military in Canada and on Ancestry. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. And if anybody asked any questions, I will look to, he's just gonna run over to the other microphone to ask me the questions.
So the first question was about the shoebox. Is there a space limit or time limit to that shoebox function?
The shoebox is always available to you, it's basically saving the link like a regular browser would do. So it's as big as your computer will hold.
Excellent. And the next question was about the Canadian and British records. Are they available both on the UK side and the Canadian side? So if we're looking for Army records from Canadians who served in British regiments,
right,
would they be able to be found? Where can they be found?
Okay, so we worked with the UK, the National Archives of the UK, but we had those records on microfilm here at Library and Archives Canada. So what you're getting as part of your Canadian subscription are these records, even though they look like they're from the UK because they were Canadian military. They're available on Ancestry Canada, as well as, depending on your subscription, you might find them on the UK site of Ancestry. But again, Ancestry digitizes these records in partnership with the archives, and so this was a massive collection we digitized from microfilm through Library and Archives Canada.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Wright, and before I start talking about the First World War, I'd like to thank Beechwood National Cemetery, Nick and Erica, who are here with us in the room, and Ancestry, Leslie Anderson, who you spoke earlier. I think it's very appropriate to be doing this, certainly doing it here in the midst of our national cemetery. With this fall-like weather, at least here in Ottawa, and I know some of you are elsewhere in Canada and even the United States, it might be a little bit different, but here it's a beautiful fall day. And it's the kind of day that it sort of reminds us that not only fall here, but Remembrance Day is coming in a few weeks. We have come through several years of commemorating the First World War, and this past summer, the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Our veterans, our Canadian veterans, are very quickly leaving the stage. And it's time, I think, to reflect on the contribution of our Canadian men and women, our ancestors, who have served our country in uniform. So I'm going to begin with the First World War. Hang on a second, folks. No, it's rules. Okay. Some of the objectives this afternoon, anyway, I'm going to just very briefly, and of course, any discussion about the First World War and its resources is by necessity fairly general. So we'll see what we can do here. I'm going to just mention briefly the nature of military service between 1914 and 1919, and the CEF service documents. That's the Canadian Expeditionary Force. I'm going to review those documents, the main documents. I'm going to try to create a CEF timeline for an individual, and I'll show you why that's important before we finish. Because this timeliner is going to give us pointers on what other records to look at. I'm also going to mention some overlooked and underused resources, and even though it's been over 100 years since the end of the war, there is still a future to CEF research. There are still records that have not been used. So the Great War began for Canada on August the 4th, 1914, and people often think that the war, when they see in media anyway, that it took place in France and Belgium on the Western Front. There were trenches and people were jumping in and out of trenches and running across no man's land. But the war was much more wider than that, and Canadians took part in many other parts of the world during the Great War. In the United Kingdom, of course, there were Canadians in the Caribbean, Belgium and France, obviously, Russia, at the end of the war. In the Middle East, Atlantic Canada, and of course it all came to a close on November 11, 1918, which was only an armistice. And if you take a very close look at the lion's mane there, the glory of the lion is in his mane, and you can see the names of the countries that made up the British Empire. Now, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. We often think, and again, it's because of what we see at Remembrance Day, men jumping out of trenches, the infantry, the people who are at the sharp end of the fighting. But men and women, Canadian men and women, were drawn from Canada's small permanent force, from the militia that Leslie spoke about. But more than this, the CEF was a citizen army, a volunteer force. And later in the war, there was conscription in Canada. But men from all walks of life, most with no military experience whatsoever, joined the CEF. The average age, if you're interested, was 26 years and 1 month. The largest single percentage were British-born, not surprising, and 75% of the CEF were single. More than just infantry. Like I said, we've grown accustomed to Remembrance Day, the media coverage, the trenches. But there are many forms of service, and I've listed some of them here. Obviously, infantry and artillery, cavalry, railway troops, for example. Almost 20,000 men served in the railway troops, and most of those probably never fired a gun in anger. The Forestry Corps spent most of its time in England and Scotland. So you can see that there's quite a variety, a very diverse sense of service. Of course, we have medical through nurses. Over 500 men served as chaplains in the First World War for the different denominations. So you get a sense of the difference in service. Now, Canadians, some of the battles are well known now. Of course, Vimy Ridge, of course, being the obvious one. But again, when looking at First War and ancestors in the war, there's a couple of key events that it's important to put a framework around the chronology. So Second Ypres in 1915, the first time that gas was used. It's a very famous story about Canadians closing the gap and the famous first German gas attack. Courcelette in 1916, the Somme, of course. Most people are familiar with July 1st, 1916. Canadians joined the Battle of the Somme some months later. And of course, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele in 1917, the 100 Days, which is the last 100 days of the war, beginning in August 1918, where the Canadian Corps played a very important role in finishing the war. And some Canadians went to Russia in 1918 in the war against the Bolsheviks. The first place to start in doing any kind of military research in Canadian resources, and it certainly Leslie alluded to it, is the Library and Archives Canada. And this is where the military records for Canadians, this is where they are. This is where the custodian is LAC. And they have a landing page, I'm not sure what they call it these days, Military Heritage. And they've got one for military heritage generally, but I want you to go to the landing page for the First World War, and it really is the place to start. It describes the files, in addition to service files, the other kinds of records that are available, and I'll show you some of that in a moment or two. But we're interested in personnel records. And so they do have a search here for, they call it Personnel Records of the First World War. And you can search by surname. You may notice when you go to this site that they have more than just the CEF. They have something called Imperial Gratuities, a non-permanent active militia, active during the First World War, rejected CEF volunteers, and there were about 4,500 in 1914 alone who were rejected from service. It also includes the Royal Newfoundland Regiment and Forestry Corps. Now, I don't have time to discuss all of that, so what I'm going to do really is just look at the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but you can look at it at LAC, you can do a surname search and you can download the file, absolutely no problem, or if you're an Ancestry user, you can do it on Ancestry in their Canadian military collections. And you can search there by name. You can also search by birth date, but I'm not sure why one would. But also they do have something else, and that's the next of kin name comes up. So for example, if you were searching a very common name like Brown, you might get a lot of William Browns, but in this case, the results on Ancestry not only give you the birth date and the place the person was born, but also the name of the next of kin, which may help you determine one William Brown from another. And it also provides regimental number, and we're going to talk a little bit about the value of the regimental number in a moment. But we're going to look at a couple of key documents. There are many key documents, but we've only got time to look at two. The first one being the attestation paper. This has been available to researchers for more than 20 years now. It is the soldier's agreement to serve in the CEF. It says absolutely nothing about actual service. Primarily, the attestation paper captures personal information. This is why it's so important and why LAC digitized these things a long time ago. Name and address, the time of volunteering, the place and date of birth, the next of kin and the relationship of that next of kin and the address of the next of kin, the person's occupation, did they have any previous service in the military, their health is certified, they're given a medical examination, and it also indicates the unit the man first volunteered with, not necessarily the unit he served with, and we're going to get to that in a little while. But it does provide a regimental service number, which in Canada is more or less unique. There are some duplication of numbers, but you can almost count on the number being unique. On the reverse side of the form, which I'm not going to show you, there is a physical description of the man, his apparent age, his religious denomination, and any identifying scars or tattoos. Emphasis here, though, is that the attestation paper only records the unit that a man first volunteered with, not the unit he served with. The other key document is called a casualty form. On some files, it has no title whatsoever. The casualty form is recognizable because at the top of the form it repeats all the personal information that you find on the attestation paper. And then it's a timeline. It's a log of movements of that individual. So his arrival and departure, a lot of them will say when he arrived in England, what ship he came on, and also when he went home at the end of the war. Any training or location, men were sent to England where they were trained in a number of locations, and that is documented on the casualty form. Any promotions or demotions, transfers from one unit to another. Wounds, illness, hospitalization is all recorded on the casualty form. Any kind of discipline is also recorded there as well. It's the only document that confirms what units a soldier served with. And so a question we often have is, my grandfather was at Vimy Ridge, or my uncle, I'm sure he was at Passchendaele in the fall of 1917. The service record itself doesn't tell you that. One has to look at this casualty form and determine what unit the man was with. And as I said before, the unit on the attestation paper is not necessarily the unit he served with, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples from my own grandfather. This is a timeline that I developed for William Percy Wright, and he joined the 169th Regiment in Toronto in January 1916, went overseas in the fall of 16, but the 169th Battalion was broken up and used as reinforcements for other units. So he found himself with the 116th Battalion, and he served with the 116th for a couple of years. In fact, until well into 1917, when he left that to become a member of a machine gun corps. Okay, so already we've got 3 different units that Percy served with. And if I do a timeline like this, based on the casualty form, I can tell where he was at a certain time. So I can tell from this that, in fact, my grandfather was at Vimy Ridge, and that he was at Passchendaele in the fall of 1917. Without doing that little bit of work, one is left swimming in a very deep pool and unable to determine exactly what an ancestor did. Now, there are other things that we can do, and I'll show you that too. But anyway, that's the value of doing a bit of a timeline, and it's simply listing on a chronology based on the file that you can download from Ancestry LAC. That's the rest of it there. Now, the timeline leads to other records, and I think anyone who does family history or genealogy, they want to look at everything, right? You want to look at all the documents. So the timeline will tell you when the soldier arrived in England. So if they shipped out of Halifax and arrived at Liverpool and they were in England for months training, it will tell you when they arrived and where they trained. And then at the end of the war, it also will bring them home again to Halifax. They also reference what are known as Part 2 orders. I'm not going to show Part 2 orders, but it is the authority behind any kind of movement that I listed, like promotion or discipline, even something like permission to marry. Okay, men in the CEF needed permission, and the permission is included in Part 2 orders. Unfortunately, they are not digitized. They're only available at LAC, but it's something that one should know about. Hospital admission and discharge registers is another large group of records, and we'll look at those in a moment. A bit more information. The timeline also points to operational records that might be available to sort of add detail to a battle, to an event. And that leads, of course, to war diaries, and I'm going to talk about war diaries because they are really critical in determining where grandfather served. And so this is why that chronology is really important, that timeline. It allows us to consult other sources. And so what are they? So I'm going to go back to military heritage and go back to that First World War landing page. And one sees over in the left-hand column sources relating to the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Over the years, the military records, by the way, constitute the largest single collection of government records in the custody of LAC, and the First War are very extensive, without doubt. And so over the years, an index has been created. So in my grandfather's case, the 169th Battalion, even though they never served in action when they got to Europe, there's a huge number of files relating to the organization of the unit, the officers in the unit, the training in Canada, the movement overseas, and what happened to it. And they've all been brought together. All these references to files have been brought together in this guide. And it's absolutely essential, once you know the unit that your ancestor served in, is to look at that guide and to see what other records might be available. And there's the guide there. It includes files on administration and organization, a history of the unit that was compiled at the end of the war. All the commanding officers had to fill in a very extensive historical form, and that is included in these records. On badges, if they had a band, okay, there'll be information about their band. Lots of honors and awards, files on casualties, on promotion, and also major and minor operations in the field, okay? So it's a place for all that additional information once we know where grandfather was. As I mentioned, the Part 2 orders, I don't have, they're not really a very attractive document, so I don't have one, but the Part 2 daily orders have transfers from one unit to another. So in my grandfather's case, I was able to follow him in Part 2 orders as well as on his file, but the Part 2 orders sometimes have a little additional information. Any hospitalization is recorded, discipline, whether the person was absent without leave, insolence, swearing at an officer, all that kind of stuff, it's all recorded here. Any kind of wounds are recorded, whether the man died is here. Any leave, and of course, as I said, men in the CEF needed permission to marry, and that is included not only on the casualty form, but in Part 2 orders, sometimes with a little more detail. Discharge from the unit, and the other important thing that is found in Part 2 daily orders is the company that a man belonged to. So you're in a regiment, and men are divided into companies and sections and so on. And that company designation is really very important, because in a battle, and we'll take Vimy Ridge for an example, in any given unit, not every company took part in the battle. So one company might have been held back in reserve or for the next day. And so they were at Vimy Ridge but took no part in it. And it's really hard to tell unless you know what company your man was in. And only in Part 2 orders is that come out clearly. It is not often found on the service documents itself. Okay, just a pointer. Hospital admission and discharge records are probably overlooked by a lot of researchers. Of course, we're all familiar with the brutality of the First World War as far as Canada is concerned. About 60,000 killed in action or died during the war. That would include people who died in accidents. It would include people who died of illness and so on and so forth. And about 175,000 were wounded. Wounds, for example, are documented on the casualty form. You'll know that someone was wounded and that they were hospitalized. And one can also go to these hospital admission and discharge books, which exist for every type of medical unit in the First World War. Not only facilities in Canada, but once overseas, stationary hospitals in one place, casualty clearing stations, which were closer to the front, special hospitals for special kinds of wounds, and convalescent facilities, those in England, in the United Kingdom, and also in Canada. These records are not digitized. They can only be looked at Library and Archives Canada, but they do identify the soldier. The length of service is recorded right down to the month, the nature of the wound, the nature of the treatment that he's receiving, and also his disposition. So if he's moved from one hospital to another, to another, to another, and finally to a convalescent home on the Normandy coast, my grandfather ended up in Trouville for several weeks. That's all recorded in the hospital admission books, and one can actually follow a soldier through that. Now, one item that we all have to learn about, and to fill in those blanks about an ancestor, are going to be the war diaries. And it's a unit diary. It's a diary is probably the best term for it. It's kept by the unit, by the battalion. They're hierarchical in organization, so there are diaries for the general staff and at the brigade level, but what we're really interested in here are the lower level diaries, the unit diaries. Now, for infantry battalions, those are the guys fighting in the trenches, jumping in and out of trenches. They appear to be only for France and Belgium, only Western Front. I don't think they were required to keep a diary when they were formed up in England, if they were training and that kind of thing. I don't think they had to keep a diary. Although the training camps themselves kept diaries, and hospitals and convalescent facilities in Britain also kept a diary. It's a daily recording of events at that particular unit. The troop ships, the ones that were going home in 1918 and 1919, also were required to keep a diary. Call it a log if you want, but they did call it a diary. So it's a daily account, like any diary. The unit diary is a daily account of activities. It could be everything from trench fighting to playing football on a day when they were in rest, okay? As far as names go, if you're researching an officer, you're in luck, because officers are mentioned by name. Other ranks are often not, okay, generally not. But the diaries include appendices on specific operations, plans, there could be maps, that kind of material that, again, will sort of wrap a lot of context around any activity that an ancestor might have been involved in. And this is what a diary looks like. This one is probably not typical, folks. This one is typewritten. Many of them are handwritten, and you know what, handwritten documents can be very confusing for some of us. This one, the 116th Battalion, is typewritten. We're very fortunate to have that. I was just going to say it was the war diary plus my grandfather's file. I was able to determine what happened on the day he was wounded. He was wounded in the fall of 1917. There's some detail there. I can find out more about what was happening on that one day. And so the diaries are really very, very important. They are available in digitized format at Library and Archives Canada. And if you go to that military heritage page, and the First World War especially, we'll explain how to access the diaries, and you can read them online, you can download or whatever you want to do. You can copy or print them, whatever. But they are all available for the First World War. There are also, only the military could keep all these records, by the way. There are records of Canadians going to England. There's a file, a voyage file. A nominal roll usually of who was on the ship, the men and so on, the units, the port of departure and arrival, and of course very specific dates. And likewise at the end of the war, a little bit different. My grandfather came home on the Royal George, so there's of course you learn the name of the ship. There's a file, a rather bulky file for every voyage. The ports where they left from, the file deals with gathering the men for that one particular voyage. So there's a nominal roll, which also includes the next of kin and the destination of the soldier. And there is, as I said, a log or diary of the voyage. And you learn about the conditions on board. I saw one file that actually had a list of the meals, like the menu of what the soldiers were served. Discipline. There's certainly, if a death occurs, there is a recording of that. There was one very sad tale of a soldier returning with his bride, and she gave birth on the ship. The baby died, and the woman died as well, and the baby was buried at sea because they were somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, and the woman died when they reached St. John, New Brunswick. Very sad tale, but that kind of thing, those kinds of details will be found on a returning voyage file, and there is one for every ship that brought soldiers and dependents back from Britain at the end of the war in 1918 and 1919. So that would bring you to discharge, and there's something to be very careful here. There's a discharge certificate. A lot of people I've discovered have one of these, you know, like grandfather had or great uncle George had. It was the certificate that a man received on the last day that he was in the CEF. He's discharged from service. So it's good to verify the information, to just take a second close look at it and note the unit that he served with. I had one of these, okay? I had one of these from my father many, many years ago from my grandfather. And it said right on there, it says that he served in the 169th Battalion. So when I joined the archives back in the 70s, I went to the military archivist, a wonderful woman named Barbara Wilson, and I said, Barbara, can I learn more? There were no files available at this time, so we had no personnel files available to us. But anyway, I said to her, well, my grandfather served in the 169th Battalion, and without looking up from her desk, she said, no, he didn't. And I thought, wow, how did she know that? And that was exactly it. Because she knew that the 169th Battalion never served as a battalion. They went to England and they were broken up for reinforcement. So I got a real good lesson that day. And it was several years. We didn't have access to the personnel files. They were kept in a separate part of the archives. And it wasn't until the late 80s, actually, I was able to see the file for myself. But anyway, that's why it's important to look at that discharge certificate. Officers, including nurses and chaplains who had officer status, they received something called a certificate of service, which is almost the same thing, maybe not as much information on it, but it's good to look at that and just sort of look back then at the earlier records to see how accurate that discharge certificate is. Now, the other item that folks are often interested in are honors and awards for the First World War. And these would be gallantry awards. Victoria Cross, Distinguished Service Order, Military Cross, those three, the second two for officers, Distinguished Conduct Medal, the Military Medal, mentioned in dispatches, and various foreign awards are all recorded on big index cards. Nurses too, nurses were eligible for foreign awards. They were eligible for a military medal. Mentioned in dispatches, and also for something specific for nursing sisters, the Royal Red Cross Medal. These are all recorded on large index cards, and they are available at Library and Archives Canada. There's an index to them, but if you want to look at the actual image, they're on Ancestry. It's one of the databases that is unique to Ancestry, where you can do the search by surname, and then you can look at the actual index card that was created at the time, and it will describe why that particular individual has been given an award. So in the case of the Victoria Cross, there's quite a long explanation of the action and so on and so forth. So very useful. Again, the images only with the index are available on Ancestry, which is really kind of good to know. Now, not to be overlooked, CEF volunteers who were rejected at Valcarce. One of the most puzzling things about doing research on the First War, researchers get the file online and they see that their great uncle George enlisted at Valcarce, Quebec. And I had a fellow say to me one day, he said he couldn't understand this. His family always lived in New Westminster, British Columbia. And he couldn't understand how the family got to Valcarce, Quebec in 1914. Well, there's an easy explanation. When the war first started, there was a fantastic rush to the colors, as they say, and about 35,000, almost 40,000 men came forward to serve, and the government was in a bit of a stick, and so Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense, ordered that a large training camp be built at Valcarce, Quebec. And that was done very quickly in August 1914. And all the men who had enlisted, who had volunteered, were assembled at Valcarce, and it was decided at that point to reboard them, okay, meaning that all of them would be reattested, okay? In fact, in New Westminster, British Columbia, the volunteer probably didn't fill a form in. Yeah, he probably simply said he wanted to serve. So they did the attestation papers at Valcarce, And of course, that's why there are some 30,000 men whose place of enlistment says Valcartier, Quebec. Conscription. Conscription came into Canada in 1917. Some 20,000, 22,000 men served overseas in the last part of the war. There are also some trench newspapers that are worth looking at. A lot of the units kept their own newspapers, their newsletters, and newspapers generally. And newspapers are much more available now than they were even 5 years ago. And Canadian newspapers carried a lot of information about those who were volunteering, those who were wounded, those who died, that kind of thing. A very important to look at local newspapers. People ask me, are there photographs? Well, oddly enough, the CEF didn't take official photographs of individuals, although there are some unit photographs available. There are some at the Canadian War Museum. There are some that are in publications where names are actually identified. It's not gigantic, but people often wonder why there wasn't a photograph taken, and I wondered the same thing, actually. There are a number of commemorative books and websites, lots of books dealing with especially those who died from a certain area. It's been a very popular piece of research in the last decade, especially with the files now available. But also there are a lot of websites that are devoted to specific units. There's a very good one for Kingston, the 21st Battalion. It's easy enough on Google to search for a CEF battalion, and there's dozens of these where people have adopted a battalion, are trying to reconstruct it with the names and the people who served. Not to be forgotten are provincial probate records. There is, of course, if a fellow died in the war and owned property or whatever and left a will, it would have been probated in the province in which he enlisted. So I have found some of these in Ontario. Very interesting, because in some cases there is documentation on trying to determine whether someone is actually dead or not. So in 1915, when a lot of Canadians died at Second Ypres and were simply missing, okay, no body was found, there was some legal legwork to be done in order for that estate to be settled without waiting for 7 years, and they were done. So provincial probate records are worth a look at. And I guess my question is that all there is? And you know, there's even more. But anyway, I just want to look very quickly at conscription. If you're looking at attestation papers, you're looking at files, you might come across this document. It's conscription. Those who were conscripted had a different kind of attestation form. And it says right on it, drafted under the Military Service Act of 1917. It's one page rather than two. It has personal information, a physical description that you would normally find on the other attestation paper, where drafted and when, okay, and the military district and the unit. Canada was divided into 13 military districts, and they organized the draftees by military district. So a draftee, you won't find a unit, okay? He has a number like everybody else, but the unit is, they'll say he joined the 1st Depot Battalion, okay? Well, that was simply a holding battalion. That was simply how they gathered those who were conscripted before sending them overseas. And of course, once they got overseas, they were utilized as reinforcements in existing units, okay? But if you see that, right away, you know that your ancestor was conscripted. Now, conscription, I think anyone listening from Canada is going to know that it was very controversial, and like it would be, I suppose, in most countries. And the records are, there are no records, and this won't move. What's wrong with it? Huh? No. I moved it. Sorry, folks. Danke. Okay, the records themselves, people were, a number of tribunals, a couple of hundred tribunals were set up throughout the country. Big towns, big cities, small ones. And people, men could come forward and try to be exempted from the act, okay? I can't go because my brother's in the service and my mother's ill. You know, there was all kinds of, I don't want to call them excuses, all kinds of stories. The records themselves, we have documented that the records themselves of people seeking exemptions are gone. But our local newspapers carried the stories. And here are a couple of stories just from Ottawa. And in fact, there's quite a bit of information about the individuals who were seeking exemption, where they worked, how old they were, whether they had two cousins and a brother in the army, that kind of thing. So again, the value of newspapers, your local newspaper for conscription, is very, very important. Very important. And we've lost it again. Trench newspapers, most of them are small runs. They often include photographs, stories, humor, and lots of personal information. The one at the top is Bruce and Cocky. That's the Bruce County. The second one, Ontario Stretcher, is a magazine that was put out by the what was called the Ontario Hospital at Orpington in England. And of course, there are pictures and stories of individuals who worked at that hospital. Most of the trench newspapers, they're called generally newspapers, even if they're newsletters or magazines, are available at the Canadian War Museum, but they're also available online at Heritage Canadiana. And if that's not on the handout, it should have been. But they are available on what's known as Heritage Canadiana. Now, I also said that maybe there's more coming. We haven't seen the end of it yet, apparently. In recent years, a number of over 200,000 pension records have been identified. I understand they have been digitized by an Ontario university, and they are not yet available to the public. The interesting thing is there's over 200,000 files, and that would account for 1/3 of all the people who served in the CEF. There are files for over 800 nursing sisters, which amount to 1/4 of all the nurses who served in the war, about 3,200 altogether. There are, and if anyone has any familiarity with microfilm, you're going to know that this is a lot. There are close to 1,500 reels of microfilm with these files. Oddly enough, it includes as well British veterans who emigrated to Canada at the end of the war. It includes some Americans and even some Australians and some Europeans who fought with the CEF and came to Canada, or they fought with their own national army and they came to Canada, and there was some kind of reciprocal arrangement so that Canada would monitor, administer the pension. But I'm not the only one waiting to see these records, believe me. Very quickly on the war dead, memorials. There are a number of Canadian memorials in France and Belgium, the most famous being our national memorial at Vimy Ridge, the one on the left. On the right at the top is Saint-Symphorien. It's near Mons in Belgium. It includes George Price, who was the last Canadian to be killed in the Great War. It's a cemetery, very interesting. It was one of the very first ones I visited on a trip to Europe, and I was quite taken aback because it included both German and British and Canadian. The point being that it started out as a German cemetery because, of course, they held Mons for the 4 years of the war. Very interesting place to start one tour. The one at the bottom is Twin Elms near Vimy Ridge. Now, just a word or two about what was going on. The Imperial War Graves Commission, now known as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, started during the war, about 1915. There was sort of a feeling that those who were dying had to be recorded, the information had to be recorded, and a very important decision was made, and that was that the remains would not be returned to the country of origin. Now you can imagine that people in England, of course, or in Scotland might have been a little bit of outrage, since it wouldn't have been very difficult to move a body from Belgium to England. But that was the decision. The second decision was that they would be buried, and rank would not be considered. Okay, so a private could end up being buried next to a colonel or whatever. So there were several hundred small cemeteries built along the lines, the trench lines that stretched through France and Belgium. But in 1919, there was an effort to consolidate them into larger cemeteries, bringing the smaller ones together to form larger ones. And using registration records, many isolated graves that were located, bodies were exhumed and reburied. Not all were found because later battles obliterated the site. The work of locating bodies ceased in 1921, and the work of designing, constructing, and indexing the cemeteries began. And again, all of these cemeteries have been indexed at Commonwealth War Graves, and I'm going to mention a Canadian site that's very important. Now, of all Canadians buried on the Western Front, one was exhumed and returned to Canada by a mother who really wanted her son home, and he is buried in Mount Pleasant. There's also a record of a man who was buried in England, who was officially exhumed and returned to Canada. The odd thing about the rule being you were buried where you fell, if you fell in the United Kingdom, you could go home if your family was willing to pay for it. And this was a case where a fellow died of sickness at Bramshot Camp in southeast England, and only months later did his family arrange to have him returned to Kincardine, Ontario. And so the church register actually shows that he was buried, and there's a notation in it saying that he was then exhumed and returned to Canada. Now, documenting the dead is interesting, and the best way to document the fallen is to look at, first of all, the important thing about the service record. It tells you whether someone died, and that's the end of the story. It doesn't tell you what happened after they died, where they were buried. There are two very important records. One called the Circumstances of Casualty Registers, and the second, War Grave Registers. And so it's important, these records, they're kept by Library and Archives Canada, of course, but the images, the index and images, the images are there. They're very difficult to use on LAC, so if you're an Ancestry user, I would go to Ancestry. And what happened, of course, is that if someone was buried and the site was later obliterated, the only record left is this piece of paper indicating where the person is buried. And we've got an interesting, this is what it looks like on Ancestry, documenting the fallen, and there's an index there. You can search by name, and it's very helpful. But this is the one I wanted to show you. It even has a Beechwood connection. This is Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, and this is his circumstances of casualty. It simply says he was killed in action, okay? In a lot of cases, they just don't know. In some cases, there's quite an explanation on this form about what happened. The key point here is that information is not on a person's service file, okay? It'll simply say on the file that he died in action, killed in action. This document may include additional information, and this is the case for Alexis Helmer. He died in 1915 at Second Ypres, and there's his War Graves Register. It's filled in. It says that he was buried at Malakoff Farm. Okay, there was no question about it. There's even a map reference. But at the end of the war, they couldn't find him. And so he is no longer in a Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery. He is commemorated on the Menin Gate in Belgium. In Ypres, there's about 5,700 Canadians. They're commemorated there. These are people, are men who died in Belgium with no known grave. And Vimy Ridge, of course, records a little over 11,000 Canadians who died in France with no grave. The interesting thing about Helmer, he is the acknowledged inspiration for the poem In Flanders Fields. His parents are buried here at Beechwood Cemetery, and Alexis is commemorated on their stone. Very interesting connection. So researching the war dead, a number of things. You should be familiar, I want you to be familiar with the Canadian Virtual War Memorial. It's a site maintained by Veterans Affairs Canada. It takes in all the information from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I call it a living memorial because you can go there, and if you find an ancestor and you want to add a photograph, you want to add a letter, you want to add a clipping from a local newspaper, you can actually add it to the website. And so start telling that man's story. Very, very interesting. But also look at Commonwealth War Graves. There is some additional information at Commonwealth War Graves Commission, a wonderful website. I did mention earlier commemorative and memorial books, lots of them, usually by city or town, by township even, by county, that kind of thing. Local histories, especially obviously those published after the war, often include information about veterans from the town or veterans from the county or township. And don't forget those who died in the United Kingdom and at sea. There are circumstances of death registers for these people as well. And a lot of people did die at sea. Very interesting. If you live in Ottawa, you are very fortunate because you have Library and Archives Canada to look at that military history page. And once things reopen, you'll be able to go to the archives and look at some of the other military resources. And probably one of the best places to do research in published material would be the War Museum, the Canadian War Museum. It's open again to the public, but the reading room is not yet. And there's 2 excellent locations locally for examining the First World War. And I think that brings us, not only the war is at an end, but so is this presentation, and I thank you for your attention. And I hope that everyone takes something away from this of value in your own personal research. Thank you.